Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
The number one selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. It seems nearly impossible to think in the 21st century, with over 8.5 billion active cell phone subscriptions worldwide, that anyone could vanish without a trace. And yet, over 600,000 people go missing in the United States every year, and a staggering number of those cases go unsolved. If I'm honest, it's one of my deepest fears and worst nightmares. One night, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was celebrating the end of the college year with some friends, when on his way home, he got into an accident and called his parents to come pick him up. He told them his location, about 10 minutes from his home in Marshall, Minnesota, and they set off to get him. But when they arrived, Brandon and his vehicle were nowhere to be found, and no one has seen or heard from him in nearly 17 years. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the mysterious disappearance of Brandon Swanson. What happened to him on May 14th, 2008? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. On the night of May 13, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was celebrating the end of the spring semester with some friends and fellow students at Minnesota West Community and Technical College's Canby campus. Brandon grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, a short 40-minute drive to the college campus. While celebrating, one article reported Brandon was drinking at the party. Quote, but he wasn't drinking enough to be overly intoxicated. End quote. After leaving the party, Brandon decided to make the short drive home before midnight. Sometime around 2 a.m. though, Brandon called his parents from his cell phone and told them he'd, quote, suddenly swerved and ended up in a ditch. End quote. It's unclear what caused Brandon to swerve his vehicle, but we do know that he was uninjured in the accident and was unable to move his car as it was high-centered, which means the underside of the vehicle was lifted with all 4 wheels off the ground. With his car immobile, Brandon told his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, he believed he was near the town of Lind, approximately 10 miles from their home in Marshall, and he asked them to pick him up. Within a few minutes, they arrived, but there was no sign of Brandon or his vehicle. They drove around the immediate area, flashing their headlights and hoping Brandon would see them. While on the phone with him, they could hear Brandon flashing his headlights as well. But neither side could see anything but darkness. As time passed, frustration mounted, and Brandon told his parents he was going to try to walk to a friend's house in Lind. He believed it was a short distance from where he was, and remained on the phone with his parents while he walked. In the meantime, Brian dropped Annette off at their home, and then went back out to try and find Brandon. At 2:23 a.m., Brandon and Brian began a phone call that would last for 47 minutes, with the two constantly trying to get to one another. One article stated, quote, during the conversation, Brandon described his surroundings to his father, at one point stating he was walking along a fence line and could see the lights of town in the distance, end quote. They agreed to meet at a local nightclub in Lind, and as the two continued talking, Brian drove around and searched for Brandon. What happened next is a real-life nightmare. As Brian continued to search for his son, he heard Brandon suddenly shout, "Oh shit," before the line went quiet. Brian called back several times, but Brandon never picked up. There was nothing but agonizing silence. The Swansons reached out to Brandon's friends and continued searching into the early morning hours of May 14th, but they had no luck finding Brandon. At 6:30 a.m., nearly 3.5 hours after Brian's last communication with Brandon, they reported him missing to the police, who did not immediately begin searching. To his parents' dismay, they were advised to wait for Brandon to contact them, as, quote, it wasn't at all unusual for a young man his age to stay out all night. It's his right to be missing, end quote. When the hours passed with no sign of Brandon, the police finally began their search, and what they discovered surprised everyone. On the night he disappeared, Brandon told his parents he believed he was near the town of Lind, and they set off looking in that area. But when police tracked Brandon's cell phone activity through nearby towers, they discovered he was in Porter, Minnesota, 25 miles, and in a completely different direction than Brandon believed he was. With this information in hand, police eventually located Brandon's car. It was stuck in a ditch like he'd said. One article stated, quote, the car was on a sort of sharp incline, nothing major, but enough that the car would get hung up, so the wheels are too high off the ground to get any traction, end quote. They found his vehicle, but there was no sign of Brandon, his car keys, or any personal belongings. Police searched the car, but found no trace evidence, no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints outside the vehicle. Authorities eventually brought in search dogs to comb the surrounding area in the hopes they would find Brandon. The dogs were able to pick up a scent and led police to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, which, quote, at the time of the disappearance was high and flowing fast. The Yellow Medicine River is knee-deep in some areas and up to 15 feet deep in others, end quote. Authorities feared the worst, that Brandon had slipped, fallen into the river, and possibly drowned. Though the worst-case scenario, they focused their search efforts in and around the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, as it was believed that if Brandon drowned, his body would have moved downriver and eventually been found. Hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, with no sign of Brandon Swanson. Extensive searches, both on land and in the air, continued through May and into the early weeks of June 2008. Despite these efforts, Brandon remained missing. Then, in March 2010, nearly 2 years after he disappeared, search dogs picked up a scent around Mud Creek, a location close to where Brandon's car was found. Authorities searched the area for several months, hoping to find something to point them in the right direction. But like every search before, they came up empty, and Brandon remained missing. Though it is impossible to know exactly what happened on May 14, 2008, several theories have been raised. Before we consider them, it is important to remember these are speculations. Truly, no one knows what happened to Brandon Swanson, and until he is found, all anyone can do is consider the possibilities. One theory is that Brandon had an unintentional accident. Remember, search dogs picked up his scent in and around the Yellow Medicine River, and authorities assumed he fell in after exiting his vehicle. Except, the river and its surrounding areas were searched extensively with no evidence or body to indicate this happened. As important, it was reported that Brandon's cell phone remained turned on for 2 days after his disappearance, quote, because every call made to the phone after his disappearance resulted in several rings and then a voicemail recording, end quote. Some speculate Brandon may have found shelter in a local farmer's shed or barn and died from exposure. It was cold the night he disappeared, with temperatures hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But this theory leaves more questions than answers. How would Brandon's body not have been discovered by a farmer or by those searching? It is possible that Brandon disappeared because he wanted to, and that now, nearly 17 years later, he is living somewhere else. Though it is possible, this seems remote as there is no evidence indicating this occurred. It's not easy to disappear without a trace, and perhaps even more difficult to stay missing. Remember, Brandon called his parents to come pick him up, and was on the phone with his father at the time the line went quiet. There are some who speculate Brandon may have died by suicide. However, this seems unlikely as Brandon's body has never been found. It isn't plausible that he would go out of his way to conceal himself before taking his life. And according to those who knew him, Brandon did not have a history of mental health struggles, substance use, or exhibit any signs of suicidal ideation. And while these don't automatically rule out suicide as a possibility, the lack of risk factors does indicate this as a less likely scenario. Finally, it is possible that Brandon fell victim to foul play. Remember, Brandon shouted an expletive before the phone line went quiet, and despite repeated phone calls, Brandon did not pick up. When authorities found his car, they found no evidence of foul play, but Brandon, his phone, car keys, and personal belongings have never been found. But like all the other theories, there is no evidence to support this. In the months following Brandon's disappearance, his parents acted and petitioned to get Brandon's Law signed into Minnesota state law. Concerned with police inaction in the first hours after they reported him missing, Brian and Annette Swanson advocated for a law that, quote, requires law enforcement to immediately begin a preliminary investigation when an adult goes missing under dangerous circumstances, regardless of their age. End quote. Brandon's Law was signed into law by Governor Tim Pawlenty on July 1, 2009. Brandon Swanson remains missing to this day. I've said before that mysterious disappearances are among the scariest stories out there. For me, the tragedy of Brandon Swanson's disappearance is twofold. There's the obvious reality that he still hasn't been found. But it's also that his parents were out looking for him and on the phone with him the moment he disappeared. As a parent, it's among my deepest fears that something like this would happen to one of my kids, who I love to my core. Brandon's final words are haunting, because they could mean anything, and I can only imagine the difficulty of hearing them and not knowing what happened. We can only hope that new evidence or leads will come in that bring answers and healing. If you or anyone you know has information, contact your local FBI office by going online to fbi.gov/contact-us/field-offices, or submitting a tip through the anonymous tip line at tips.fbi.gov/home. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering and haunting question. What happened to Brandon Swanson in the early morning hours of May 14, 2008? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.